Welcome back to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. On this week's episode, we have a guest host, so please be the same respectful audience you are for me and enjoy.
This episode is brought to you by Heidi. Imagine kicking back while a HIPAA-compliant AI scribe writes your soap notes for free. Yes, you heard us right, Heidi is free. I'm Dr. Tom, Heidi's CEO and founder, and we started Heidi to stop clinicians wasting their life on clinical documentation. Heidi transforms your consult babble into crisp, clear soap notes, personalizing itself with every edit. One day, Heidi will be your AI resident, looking through research, explaining plans, and doing anything you don't want to. If you currently pay for an AI scribe in your practice, you should swap to Heidi. We'll even credit you for anything you've already paid. Dive into the description for the link and make your practice the envy of every stethoscope in town. Sign up and watch Heidi work its magic, all for free, because you've got better things to do.
This is Dr. Cobin Soelberg, private practice anesthesiologist and financial planner. Today I'll be talking to Dr. Matt Ashley. Matt is a colleague of mine who is a urologist and currently spends the majority of time working in industry, helping with medical devices and training other physicians. Part of the reason I wanted to bring Matt on today and talk to our listeners is when I saw him a few months ago, there was just a lightness and like a delight in talking to him. I wondered what was different. And once we started talking, I found out he was working in industry. It immediately clicked. And so I thought there's a lot of actionable and practical insight that Matt could share for other physicians and especially other surgeons to show what other options are out there for all of our colleagues if you are looking for different career opportunities or different ways to practice. So please welcome Dr. Matt Ashley today. I know you'll enjoy this conversation.
Hey, this is Brad Block, host of the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle.
Welcome, Matt. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's exciting for me to be able to talk about this because much of the past few years of my career have really been trial and error. What I'm doing now, there weren't a lot of people I knew that were doing things that were similar, other physicians that were doing things that were similar. So there wasn't a very well-defined path. And now looking back, there were some key moments there that I hope can shed some light for people that might be thinking about, similar options for themselves.
Yeah, I definitely think you have a lot to offer. Before we jump in, so one of the things I always love working with you, Matt, because, often what we're talking about is what we're reading and, different books and whatnot. I was a philosophy undergrad and I know was it comparative literature or, tell me a little bit about that. Like, how do you think that shaped both, like your undergrad career, certainly, but like, how has that shaped your medical career and what you're doing now? Because, like you and I, those sorts of degrees are few and far between in healthcare.
It's true. I was very late to medicine. I wasn't pre-med. Like you said, I was a comparative literature undergrad. And the reason I did that is just because that's what I liked doing. I liked reading and I liked talking about books and that sort of environment. Once I got to the end of college and had graduated, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I thought I was going to go into academia in that realm. And after writing a thesis, realized that was not where I wanted to go. And I had a couple of my roommates' parents were physicians. And it was, looking back now, a very spur of the moment, not well considered move was to do my post-bac in a year and start down that path. I spent much of my early years in medicine, whether it was med school or residency, pursuing my comparative literature background because I wasn't good at the really hard science. I had a really hard time pre-med. A lot of the first 2 years of med school were really challenging for me. But now, with the way my job has evolved, and really, as soon as it became more of like a true clinically practicing physician, the skills of reading, writing, communicating, that became really valuable. And that's just continued to progress as I've become more involved in industry. What is really prized by any sort of company is the ability to talk to doctors. It's not a particularly common skill. And if you can do it, it's really valuable.
Well, and you're sort of right at that interface, right? I think you hit the nail on the head. I think if someone were to ask me what was so valuable about my philosophy degree, it's the ability to think through an argument and communicate that to someone else, especially when you're not quote unquote speaking the same language. So I think what you're doing is really unique. So why don't you tell our listeners today what your current role is in like the medical device field?
Yeah. So right now I'm an associate medical director at Teleflex, which is a really large medical device company, multinational in all kinds of different specialties. I generally focus mainly in urology related products. But what I do with them, I have a really diverse role there. So part of what I do is what I would say is have the more traditional physician in industry tasks, which is things like regulatory submissions, editing communications, whether it's internal or external, to the company or other physicians or to investors. So I do a lot of that, but then I've been able to also really get into some of the R&D aspect. I'm not an engineer, but I'm able to talk to engineers. That helps a lot. So I do lots of R&D. I do quite a bit of work in the mergers and acquisitions department. So the company I work for is very large and they're always buying other small companies. I play a role in many situations, the clinical voice in those type of evaluations of those companies. And then I do a lot of scientific communication. So that being presenting at meetings, whether it's real academic presentations, it's sponsored presentations through industry, and then still actually quite a bit of hands-on teaching. This is particularly true in developing markets. So I spend a lot of time in Asia now where some of our products are being launched, with getting new physicians started, building up the infrastructure there from a clinical and medical affairs standpoint. And that's, in addition, I still have 1 week a month where I'm just a regular urologist in my same practice.
The thing that I remember when we worked together a couple months ago is, there was almost this lightness about you. And like when we started talking about it, you seemed really engaged and that you're having a blast. Like you're just having a ton of fun in a way that I think when we talk with most of our colleagues who are just doing clinical work all the time, I think most people feel pretty beat down, but you looked really engaged and happy. Can you tell our listeners like how, because I know this didn't just drop in your lap, and I know it was a long process over a couple of years to get where you are right now. How did you get into this role at all?
Yeah, no, it's funny that you say that. My wife has actually used that exact same term with me when I was talking to you the other day about someone, an acquaintance we have. And I was like, oh yeah, they're actually really friendly. And my wife said, no, they're not more friendly. You just don't walk around like you hate your life every day. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I guess that makes a difference also. No, it's one of the things that I've noticed is that, part of it is I really enjoy the type of work I'm doing, and the diversity and the time away from clinical medicine has just been such a lifestyle improvement for me. And the way that it's changed my family life too has been a real positive. I can talk about that later. But as far as kind of how I ended up here, so I started off, I was practicing. I had sort of a special interest in one area of urology in BPH. So I started using various devices, and I got experienced with one and got to the point where I was asked by the company to start teaching and having a little, what they call the preceptor program. So I basically have other docs would come in and spend a day with me, and I'd go through my workup and then do some cases and talk to them there. And then that morphed into traveling around and doing that. So doing that outside of my own setting. And then, I started to realize that was really my favorite part of my job. So I just kept doing more and more and more of it, and very much fell into the trap that many physicians are familiar with of only adding and never taking anything away. And so I just kept doing more of this, teaching and preceptor work, and got into a little bit of their R&D. But it was basically I just added a second job essentially to what I was doing. I had the same clinical practice, and I just kept adding more and more hours onto it. And that was in the role that a lot of people are in. It's a really common thing for physicians to do, which is I was just a contract. I was just taking contract work, and I was getting, paid an hourly rate. And it was great, and many people do that really, really successfully. For me, what started happening was I just got to the point where all I was doing was work. I would finish my clinical job, and then I would start my other job basically. And it was challenging because that contractor work, I really enjoyed it. And so I just didn't want to I didn't want to pull back on those hours, and I kept getting more opportunities that were really hard to say no to. But I also knew that I had my clinical job. I think like many physicians, you just have this idea that your clinical employer or your partners or whoever you answer to, there's one way that you do it. And that was the way that they described to you when you started. And that's just all there is. I eventually reached a kind of a tipping point where something had to give because I just didn't have enough time.
And how long are we talking about here? Was this like 12 months you were doing this? Was this?
Yeah, it was about 2 years. We got to this point where I knew something had to change, and the company I worked for posted this job for associate medical director, and it was a part-time position. It was an employed position, which is really different than a contractor position. And I talked to my wife about it, and after a lot of back and forth, we said, okay, well, I'm gonna apply for this and kind of see what happens. But I applied for it really I didn't think I would get it because I knew the other people applying, and they were all so different. A lot of what you see with physicians that work in industry, there's two primary groups of physicians that work in industry, especially like as employees. And so those are physicians that really never practice, and it was never their goal to practice. These are lots of, MD PhDs, MD engineer types that just, they have their MD, but they just went straight there. So there's that group. And then there's the group of very late stage, late career physicians that are either just about to retire or they've already retired, and they're kind of looking for something else to do. They don't want to practice clinically. They kind of find their way into industry that way. And that's really the two big groups there. And when I was applying, that was everyone except me. And the reason for that is because the way that we work, really, if you go back even further, the way that we are taught, but the way that our work is structured is that's just not an option. You're either a clinical physician, or you're a clinical physician that does contracting, and that's really it. Just the system's not really built for that. So I applied for this job without really understanding how I was going to change my clinical work. And it wasn't until I got the job that I had to start, having, really thinking about, okay, well, how is this actually going to logistically work?
Are you looking to diversify your investment portfolio and maximize your returns? By learning short-term investing skills, you can yield higher returns at compressed speeds by creating income on a daily and weekly basis. Today's sponsor, Lightspeed Investing, has amassed over a decade's worth of success and experience in this field to teach you how to leverage the futures and commodity financial markets. Inspired by the billionaire natural gas trader John Arnold, Lightspeed Investing has built a proprietary training and educational platform. For more information, connect with President and CEO Philip J. Hawk Chan on LinkedIn, or you can start your journey towards financial freedom and abundance at Lightspeed rates, like many medical professionals already have.
Yeah. And I want to back up for just a second, Matt, because you said something that I think was really powerful. Like, as you started doing this industry work, you had the insight to notice that was the part of your day that you enjoyed the most. And I think that's really important for all of us, because I do think there's certain parts of our job, even our clinical jobs, that we really, really enjoy. And there's a lot of the, and I would bet for almost all of us, the administrative part of our clinical jobs that we despise. And I do think it's really important to pay attention to those cues and figure out how to do more of the things that we enjoy and less of the things that make our days miserable. And I think it's pretty powerful that you were able to see that and keep pushing and keep taking, essentially baby steps until you were forced to make a decision. So I think that's really important for people to hear.
Yeah, there definitely was. There was just a point where I just kind of had to make the leap, and it was really uncomfortable. When you have a job like a physician that you've spent a decade plus and, countless dollars and put your family through, what we put them through. And then all of a sudden you say, okay, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different here. That's a really difficult place to be for the physician and, for your partner too, because there's a lot of questions for them too, because like for me, it was really uncharted territory. And, a few of the really early things I had to learn that came up, one was that So I'm looking at my, my industry contract, and, the first thing when you're transitioning from a contractor setup to an employee is that, so basically I was going to say my part-time contract said, okay, you're going to be working X amount of hours per week, and this is what it is. And so I thought, great, well, I know what my contractor hourly rate is, so I'll just multiply it by that and we're good to go. That's not how that works. So when you're employed, it's a totally different calculation. And there's, lots more liability, lots more things tied up in that. And really the most kind of general concept for someone who's thinking about, working in industry is that if you are working in industry as a physician, primarily as like, like not a just pure executive, you will not make more than you do as just a busy clinician. Like you can get to where it's about the same, but sometimes there's an idea that if you work in industry, like you get paid way more, and that's not true. And so there are tons of other benefits to it, but that's one of the big hurdles that people will have is figuring out if you're thinking of a hybrid type schedule where you're employed with an industry, is getting the numbers to work where you're not taking a pay cut from when you were just a busy physician. And so that was kind of the first thing that we had to figure out was that. And then the next thing was the scheduling piece. And so, I've talked about this before, but this was what I was so worried about, because within my multi-specialty group that employs me, I just thought there was no way. There was no way that they were going to build something that's so different than everyone else. We're a production-based group, and that's how we do it. And it's very upfront, and it's in all our contracts. And it's very much a kind of physician mindset that's deeply rooted in our training, that you're taught to not question, what's presented to you from your employer. And that's one of the most powerful tenets of residency. None of us have that training or those instincts. And I actually, looking back now, I was actually going to leave the job I'm in now and take essentially, there are these, just a handful of these essentially like hospitalist urologist jobs that was in a different city, because I was like, I'm not even going to talk to my group about it. I know they're going to say no. I've got to do this kind of weird setup and work it that way. And it was my wife actually who said, just ask them, just tell them what you want and see what they say. I sent an email to the COO of my medical group and said, this is what I want to do. And it was this very deferential email where that I know you can't do it and I'm just going to leave anything. And it's just like, looking back, I just cringe looking at it now. But I kind of explained what I was looking for. And I had this other job that, this part-time job that I really loved and I wanted to do more of. And so he just said, well, just come on in and we'll just talk. Through that process, I learned a couple really important things about working with your employer. So one is that I include myself in this group, but a lot of physicians had assumed that the chairman of your multi-specialty group, the CEO of the hospital, the people in charge from an executive standpoint are just swimming in cash. Like they're just Scrooge McDuck in it, at home, when they get off work and there's these piles of money lying around that they're just not giving to the physicians. And there's this kind of, and a lot of this comes from it's so convoluted the way that we build. So if you have Epic or you have one of these, if you have one of these platforms where you see how much you build and you just think, well, gosh, I get 10th of that. Like, where does all this money go? And it seems like there just must be so much money out there that we're not getting. And this is where, I think this is the root of a lot of trouble in negotiations between physicians and their employers is that there's this idea that there's all this money out there that we're just kind of not getting. In reality, in almost all healthcare systems, the margins are really thin. And I've gotten much more of a window into this. I'm on the board of my clinical company now. And you see that, yes, we bring in tons of money, but there's a ton of money coming in. There's a ton of money going out. And a lot of that goes to physician compensation. The physician market is such that most places are probably paying the physicians about as much as they can pay them. Now, that's not to say that they can become more efficient or capture more, non-production dollars and raise salaries, but organizations typically don't skimp on physician comp because it's so costly to lose a physician. I knew that right off the bat, what you cannot ask for in general is I want to get paid the same for less work, or I want to get paid more for the same amount of work. There's no extra money out there. So that was, and that was one thing that my medical group was really helpful and upfront with is that, listen, like this is, we look back at, historically what I produce. And I said, this is kind of how much, you can produce. This is kind of how much we can pay you for any given amount of time. But what we can do is we can give you a ton of flexibility if you want it. If that's what's important and you're not asking for more money for less work, there is way, way more room for flexibility than I think many of us realize. And so we just kind of sat down and started sketching out, okay, well, what is one day of work worth for me? What is 1 week? What is my overhead? And basically got to the point where they said, okay, we obviously can't lose money on you. We don't want to lose you because patient access is really important. And the ability to take call is really important. So that's really important to all my other partners. So that's important to the whole group. So he said, as long as you're not, as long as you're not losing money on you and you're taking the same amount of call as everyone, we're really open-minded in how we can organize this. So my priorities were, I wanted a lot of flexibility and I wanted a really predictable income. And so what we came to was a system where instead of being, production based, where you can have these, big ups and downs, depending on if you have a busy month or a not so busy month, is that we just made me a shift worker basically. And that shift work equation was based on what I had done for years and years here, obviously under the agreement that as soon as I became a shift worker, I couldn't cut my clinic in half. I have to continue working like I do, or the equation, they'll catch on to that one pretty quickly. That fixed the predictability problem. And so I said, okay, so now I'm a shift worker. I have a certain amount of shifts that I'm going to work, every month. And that's my life when I'm in clinic is the same. I'm in clinic, I'm in OR, I'm seeing the same amount of patients, doing the same kind of stuff. But from a flexibility standpoint, I said, okay, I can work, 7 total days per month, 5 clinic in a weekend. I'll take call for the majority of those. So I do the same, but I want to be able to schedule this out and I want to be able to pick my weeks of a year in advance. They said, great, that works fine for us. And then what that allowed me to do was with my industry job, I travel quite a bit for it. I know what my whole year looks like. So I can then piece together these trips and meetings and all these other types of things in a way that's just so much less disruptive. I'm not rescheduling patients all the time. And it eventually came to a point that it worked out for everyone. It was honestly so much easier than I thought it would be. It's just understanding what levers there are to pull on both sides.
Well, and it's funny you say that because that's exactly what I was just thinking is really, that seems like such a positive outcome. And it seems like on both sides of that negotiation is really understanding what those levers are. And that's, money is part of that, of course, but really, it's the time and like you said, the predictability is one of the biggest ones. And so I think that's great. That's, I want to talk a little bit about, so, you mentioned earlier that this has been a really positive change for you personally and for your family. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. No, I was, a very typical surgeon, or I shouldn't even say surgeon, just busy physician where, I had spent, I finished med school in 2010. So, the past roughly 15 years, almost as like a spectator to my own family. I was mainly at work. I didn't help a whole lot, even though I kind of thought I did. And in addition to that, the whole family really ran on my schedule. It was sort of it was just understood in the family that my schedule was the most important thing. And the one thing that could never happen was I was late for clinic or I missed a day or there was something I had to do that I couldn't. That had just kind of become the norm for us, over time. And it sort of starts in residency, like even before we had kids, where you really have very little control over your life. I think it's a little bit different now, but certainly when I was a resident, that was the case. And that just kind of became the way the family operated. And it just, even when I finished residency and I, in theory had more control over my schedule, I didn't act like it. I was still just kind of doing the same stuff and expecting everyone to be on my schedule. And so it took a really big, change in job and change in family life to see that was a really there were some challenging times there when you come to that realization that coming home from work and doing the dishes for 20 minutes, that's not an equal share of the, like, that doesn't make you like a really helpful, in partner. It doesn't matter that, your day was really hard, at the hospital or at the clinic. And so, part of this process was, kind of realizing the really unfair demands I'd made on my family for many years. My wife had just basically been picking up slack for me since I started residency. And that's something that I just recently kind of really came to understand that. And it's a really hard thing to come to understand because you kind of have to look at all the stories that you had told yourself all those years. Number one of which is, but I'm doing this for my family. That's kind of like the number one corrosive story that doctors tell themselves. And I was very much a victim of that. Coming to the realization that, that maybe this isn't all for them. Maybe there's a lot of this is for me. That was a big turning point for wanting to make a big change, not, really played into having the fortitude to say, okay, I'm going to do this thing that's really different because I need to do something that's different because what I've been doing for the past 12, 13, 14 years is not how I want to live, not what I want my family to experience.
Well, and I think that's really powerful, Matt, because I almost guarantee that most physicians have a sense of that somewhere, that sense that like something's not working, something's not right. They may not know what that is. They may have not gone through the journey like you did, but they know something's not right and they want something to be different. But those are really tough truths to have to face that, like it's very easy at work, right? Like people, your patients are thankful for the work you do. The hospital is mostly thankful for us showing up and doing our jobs. Like we get accolades for being great doctors, but, at home, it's not the same thing, right? Like, so I think it's very easy to default. And I think this was probably true in the industry, but especially as a doctor, it's much easier to show up and do that work and get those rewards than to do the harder, more long-term work, being a great spouse, being a great parent. So that's pretty, that's something that we've talked about this a lot, but that's something you hadn't mentioned before. And that really does hit home.
Yeah. I think my physician public service announcement is if you are having arguments at home about your schedule and your participation in your family, and afterwards you find yourself saying, I don't know what these people are talking about because I'm doing this all for them. Oh man, that needs to get fixed. That was where I was, and that's like a separate podcast series probably, but I would just throw that out there as that's one of those things when I look back, that I wish I would have realized a lot sooner and I'll still work on it. But that's a sign that things are not going down the right path.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop today, Matt, but I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you sharing this with all of our guests or all of our listeners today. I think there's so much to learn. So if there's surgeons or other physicians out there who want to know more, is it okay if they reach out to you?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to talk with anyone. It's been such a positive development in my life that I'm really happy to kind of share how I got here. One thing, that we didn't get to talk about much, but there is so much opportunity within the world of industry, particularly for physicians that are actively practicing. So you have those two groups that I mentioned that are not really clinically active, and they have a ton of value. Both of them do, and they bring great things to the table. But what is really underrepresented in industry is people who are actually practicing, actively trying new things, in the mix, understand doctor issues, that are current. And a lot of the reason for that is because there is no pathway for it. And this is why this was so challenging for me to get here. But there is, in my work with my company, I'm always amazed at how much there is, how much value you can bring as someone who is still in the clinical realm. So there's tons of opportunity out there. It's just not something that's commonly done. So it tends to be underappreciated by both industry and physician.
Well, and that really, honestly, that's the reason I wanted to bring you on and have our listeners hear your story, because I think, if you're just nose to the grindstone, you don't even know there's other options. And like you said, there really isn't, it's not a well-defined path like we're used to doing, right? It's not pre-med to undergrad to med school to residency. Like you are sort of making your own path. But I also think the reason it's so rewarding for you, Matt, is because you're making your own path. So thank you for sharing your story today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's fun.
Thanks again from Heidi. Elevate your practice with a free AI scribe, zero cost, HIPAA compliant, and time saving. Ready to swap? We've got you covered for past AI scribe expenses. Head to HeidiHealth.com, get started, and make your practice the envy of every stethoscope in town. Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.